Podcast.
It's Build a Big Podcast, the marketing podcast for podcasters. Bigpodcast.com is the site. My name, David Hooper. In this episode, the audio edition of my weekly newsletter. That's called Big Podcast Insider. It comes out every Friday morning via email. If you want that, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. You can also follow along there. Everything that I'm talking about here is how to build a bigger podcast, grow your audience, serve more people, make more money from your message. Here's what I'm covering in this episode. In a world when Oprah calls, feature updates to help podcasters stand out on Spotify, how your listeners define podcast, 30 plus ways for podcasters to use AI, custom soundtracks for your podcast, the 1331 workshop method. This is a monetization strategy for your podcast. And as always, some classified ads, products, and services that I think will help you grow your podcast. This episode brought to you by Riverside.fm, the leading platform to record studio quality remote podcast and video. But it does a whole lot more than record podcast. I was talking to a buddy of mine, Will. He's a podcasting guy. Just yesterday, we were having a conversation about his podcast. Will had a stroke a few years ago. He's doing okay, still podcasting, but he doesn't work like he used to. And he was talking to me about how Riverside.fm has helped him with his podcast production. One of the things that he likes, Riverside.fm calls it magic clips. It goes through your podcast, through what you've just recorded. It finds the highlights and it automatically chops them up for you. It's great for social media, for promotions, teasers. It's included with all Riverside.fm accounts. Here is how to try it for free. They're going to give you a couple of hours. You can test it, see what you think about it. You go to Riverside.fm, you're going to get a free account. This is a discount code should you want to keep using it. And I think you're going to want to. You'll get 15% off using this code. Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. That's Riverside.fm, the discount code to get 15% off. Big Podcast, BIGPODCAST. Hey, you've heard this before. You know how it works. I'm going from thing to thing to thing. And in between those things, because they're all about podcasting, and frankly, it can get a little bit messy, I play this sound. That's when you know it's time to turn the page. If you want more info, the direct links, you will find that at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. You ready? Wait for it. In a world. You've seen those movie trailers. That's Don LaFontaine. And the reason he did that is because world building is a big part of setting the scene for the story that you are about to see or hear. It works for movies. It's going to work for your podcast. I've been thinking a lot about this. My wife is releasing a novel. I've got it linked, newsletter.bigpodcast.com if you're curious about it. It's a young adult fiction novel. She talks about this world building. It's a different world that she is writing about. And she sets the scene and then she tells a story just like we do with our podcasts. Writers, filmmakers, television producers, we create our work in a very similar way. And even those of us with an interview format podcast or even nonfiction podcast, we need to think about this. World building doesn't have to be creating a fictional world. It could be as simple as setting the scene for your story or the scene for what it is that you're about ready to talk about. At the beginning of this podcast, what do I talk about? This podcast is about growing your audience, bringing more people to your podcast, having impact, making money with your message. That is world building. Lexicon, the vocabulary that you use, that is world building. And you hear that a lot on this podcast. I've got an entire chapter about it in my book, Big Podcast. That lets people know that yes, this podcast is for me, or no, this podcast is not for me. It is how you tell the insiders from the outsiders. You come to where I am in Nashville, Tennessee, Southerners talk a certain way. People from Nashville talk a certain way. Maybe you've got a street in your city, and how the locals say it is completely different from how it looks on paper. Nashville, we've got a street called Demumbrian. You would look at it, and people say this all the time, oh, I'm going to take a ride on Demon Bruin. Hey, you're not from around here, are you? Is it McLean or McLean? If you're from Memphis, you know the difference. Olentangy or Olentangy. If you're from Columbus, you know that one. Every place has their version of that. The freeway, the highway, the interstate, people call it different things, different places. That is part of world building. This lets people know that you are an insider or an outsider. You belong or you don't belong. It is your belief system. It's your stake in the ground, the flag you fly. All these things are world building. Your music, your attitude, that is world building. Music is huge, by the way. This is one of the reasons the companies pay big money to use certain songs in their ads. By the way, if you go to newsletter.bigpodcast.com, I've got a video of me as a Disney character. I didn't make it. Somebody sent it to me, but you can see it. It has me delivering this podcast, Build a Big Podcast, as a Disney character. It was just a random clip, not very important. But I used that clip because it was the last video that I had to test a service that attaches music to video. I'm going to talk more about that in just a bit. Anyway, the point is this. Music is world building. Music made that boring clip taken out of context, and it turned it into something emotional. You're getting into the story because of the music. Here's the bottom line. World building is what separates your podcast on whatever it's about from the other podcasts that talk about the same thing. Is your world obvious to first-time listeners? If not, this is something you need to take a look at. More information, links to that Disney David video, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. When Oprah calls. People tell me, Oprah's not in the air anymore. Why do you keep using her as an example? Well, she's still important, for one. But replace Oprah with Ellen, or Dr. Phil, or The View, or The Talk, or Kelly Clarkson. Any big name that could put your message out to a lot of people at once. And I want you to think about this. Are you ready for those opportunities? I used to work with musicians, as you might know, and I've worked with so many that came up to me wanting to be on the big stage before they actually showed up and did the work, or they thought the big stage was what would enable them to do that work. I'd hear things like this. Man, if I could just play Madison Square Garden, then I'd really bring it. That's not how it works. If you want to get on the big stage, you've got to play the smaller ones first. Not just to build an audience. That's part of it, though. The reason you want to play the small stages is because that's where you develop the skills to handle the big stages. It's not unlike money. If you can't handle a little money, you're not going to be able to handle a lot of it. Now, I got a buddy of mine. He's got this John Madden quote. He says, winning is a great deodorant. And that's true. What he means by that is when you're doing well, you've got a lot of money, maybe you've got a big audience, you can get away with some stuff that doesn't have to be perfect. If you've got a big audience, for example, a big mailing list, and you give that audience an offer, hey, buy the tickets to this show. Hey, subscribe to this podcast. If that audience is big enough, you don't have to be a very good marketer, have a good conversion rate, or even have a great offer. All you've got to do is make the offer. You ever seen a guy do that at the club? Hey, you want to go on a date? 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 You ask enough women that, one of them is going to say yes. That's what happens when you've got a big audience. But a big audience, that's not going to save you. What's going to save you is the work that it takes for you to get that big audience. That's the difference. This happens in all industries, by the way. Think about the people who hit big via viral videos or reality television. Boom, they're everywhere. Then they're not. That's because they haven't developed the skills. So I'm going to tell you, embrace the skills. And as far as developing the skills, I've got a method. You've heard me talk about it. It's called the Sausage Factory Formula. I've got a diagram that shows what it is, and I've got more info linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Feature updates to help podcasters stand out on Spotify. Spotify for podcasters, you and I know it as Anchor. It's a great example of insider language. We don't call it Spotify for podcasters. Anchor, baby. Always and forever. It's not X, it's Twitter. It's like my grandmother. Hey, Grandma, can we go to Sears? She called it Sears and Robux. That's how you know insiders from the outsiders. Anchor, now known as Spotify for podcasters, they've got some new options for podcasters, including podcast page customizations, impression analytics, if you want to know where your audience is coming from, and more ways to turn listeners into fans. Here's what you're going to be able to do soon. You will be able to manage your presence on Spotify by customizing your show page and selecting a preview clip when your podcast is recommended to new listeners. The preview clip, let's call it a trailer. I'm working on those with some of my guys in Big Podcast AMP. Talk more about that in a minute. Your trailer is going to be the first thing a lot of people hear. It's got to be good. And Spotify is giving you an opportunity to put that first and foremost on your page. So I think that's good. Also, this is what I just mentioned a minute ago. You'll be able to see exclusive insights into how your podcast gets discovered on Spotify, including impression analytics. This goes back to what I said a minute ago about being great at marketing. If your audience is big enough, you don't have to have a lot of conversion. But, if you can get better at that conversion and you've still got that big audience, you're going to do better. Let's look at those numbers. Let's say you convert 1%. All right, let's bump it up to 2, 3%. You've just doubled and tripled how many people are listening to your podcast. They're going to give you information that's going to help you do that. You'll also be able to explore more ways to monetize your podcast via Spotify for podcasters. Is that going to be good or bad for you? I don't know. They've got ads right now. Sometimes I think those take away. At least the generic ones do, the ones they attach. If all of a sudden I go into a Geico ad, 15 minutes could save you 15%. That's ridiculous. However, earlier on, you heard me talking about Riverside.fm. That works for this podcast. These classified ads I'm going to get into later in this episode, that works for this podcast. Are the opportunities with Spotify for podcasters good? I don't know, but they're coming. I know a lot of old school podcasters don't take Spotify as a serious platform. I certainly get that. It's not a great listening experience for podcasts. It is a far better platform for music. I love it for music. Podcast, no way. However, a lot of people do use Spotify, not just young people. A lot of older people are using Spotify for podcasts. And by older, I mean over 30. It's something you want to pay attention to. If you want more information about this, all the changes that are coming, I've got everything linked. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. How your listeners define podcasts. This is something else that's changing. Old school podcasters, by God, it's got to have an RSS feed. It's audio only. It's got to be decentralized. YouTube is not a podcast. Is it? Look, I don't care. I don't care what you call it. Just listen to it. Let's make it easy for you to listen to it. That's what I want to help you do. This is an interesting graphic. I've got it linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. It's from Pod News. It's worth 1,000 words. And it's something that you need to keep in mind when talking to potential listeners, because what you think is not necessarily what they think. Remember, insider language, if they're not insiders, they're not going to know what you talk about when you talk about RSS or packets of information going down the internet, blah, 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 blah. They think of it as radio on the internet, or they think of it as a YouTube show, whatever. Just show them how to get it. Here's the bottom line. Podcast consumers now think of podcasts, when you use that word, as audio or video. There are a lot of arguments like this in podcasting, by the way. I had a guy get into it with me. I was using the word streaming. He said, it's not streaming. There's no such thing. It's a progressive download. Why do we have a streaming chart on Billboard? It's streaming. Call it a progressive download if you want. Everybody else is calling it streaming. Another thing I got into one time, which is completely ridiculous. I mentioned having raw tape that needed to be edited. Look, I get it. It's not magnetic tape. But this is what we call it, raw tape. And this guy, voiceover guy, he said, man, you're still using tape? This makes me question your professionalism. Okay, well, question all you want. But when you go into a studio for voiceover or radio, regardless of how you're recording it, raw tape or something digital, they are going to call it tape. I also say that I'm going to roll up my windows in the car, even though nothing is being rolled. And I dial a telephone, even though I'm actually pushing buttons. Don't die on this hill. Your job is not to educate listeners about the one true definition of podcasting. Your job is to get them to listen to your podcast however they define it. You want more thoughts on this? Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. 30 plus ways for podcasters to use AI. Yes, there are downsides to AI, but for the most part, AI has been very helpful when it comes to podcast creation and production. For example, I use a tool called AudioPen. I can take this, what I'm saying right now, upload it to AudioPen. It spits out a written outline of what I've just said. It can give me an article of what I've just said, tweets of what I've just said. It can be helpful. And there are tools that go way beyond that. They will help you with your podcast. I've got 30 plus ways to use AI for some things you may not have thought about and reminders of what you have thought about but may not be doing. For example, personal brainstorming assistant, AI is great for that. Summarizing large amounts of text, AI is great for that. General content outlines and structures. Again, That's what I'm using AudioPen for. So it's a great tool. If you're not using AI, take a look at it. Maybe it will work for you. If it doesn't work for you, just go back to what you were doing. All the information linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Custom soundtracks for your podcast. Do I need to put music behind this? All right. Toonie is only $19 right now, and it will allow you to create custom music for your podcast. Do you want to hear what that sounds like? No, not the music behind this. I've got a video, talked about it earlier. It is me as a Disney character. Toonie did the background music on this. A little more on this video. It was just a random clip of a podcast. The Disney character that was generated via a tool called Midjourney. The reason I'm mentioning it here is that it's a great clip to show how even the most basic music on random audio can change the emotion of what you're hearing. It can make that clip seem more important and emotional than it is. Huge payoff. It's only $19. I've got it linked, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. The 1331 workshop method. This is an opportunity for you to monetize your podcast. When it comes to making money with podcasts, a lot of people consider advertising and sponsorship as the first step. And that can be, especially if you have a large audience. But what happens when you work in a very specific niche? There are not a lot of people. Maybe you don't have a big audience. A paid live workshop can be a nice balance of quick money and also something helpful for that audience. Also, a way for your audience to get together in person, connect with each other by learning something, by meeting other people. They're going to give that credit to you. They're going to have a great experience. That's a great way for you to build loyalty with your audience. Again, it's called the 1331 workshop method. It's a nice formula to make that happen. I've got it linked at newsletter.bigpodcast.com, but let me give it to you really quickly. 1331. Remember that. 1, you're going to give a clear outcome for the customer, 3 steps to achieve that outcome, 3 lessons for each step, and then at the end, that final 1, a Q&A session to help implement these things. This doesn't even have to be a full event. When I talk about a paid workshop or even just a workshop, something to get your audience together, you could do this in maybe an hour. So if you're interested in either validating an idea or just a simple way to do something that will help your listeners and make you a few bucks, this is something you may want to consider. If you really want to go deep with this, I've talked about Big Podcast AMP. I'll talk about it here in a minute, but that's Big Podcast AMP, AMP. It's called the Audio Monetization Program. This is the kind of thing that I work on with people. If you want to monetize your audience like this, if you want to grow a business out of your podcast, look, I can help you. All this stuff is linked, the 1331 method, more information about AMP. It's at newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Classified ads for you. Swell AI automates writing podcast summaries, articles, social posts, and more. You're going to manage multiple shows in one dashboard, build custom templates for each show. It connects to Google Drive, Dropbox, and Zoom. As soon as you're done with your podcast audio, it gets automatically sent to Swell AI. Episode notes are generated automatically. It's very cool. You can get started for free. I've got it linked, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Also, privacy. Privacy lets you control when, where, and how much you can be charged. I love this thing. It's basically a burner credit card. So if you're ordering anything online, you're worried about your credit getting stolen, you're worried about privacy, people finding out who you are. Look, I don't want to be up in your business, but I know some of those sites you've been visiting. Hey, I don't kink shame, but I will tell you, you might want to use privacy. I've got it linked, newsletter.bigpodcast.com. A final thing for you, when you are ready, this is how I can help you even more. I talked about Big Podcast AMP, Audio Monetization Program. This is a personal coaching program. I've designed it to help you do 3 things. 1, grow your podcast audience. 2, get people talking about your podcast. And 3, make more money with your podcast. I've got all the details linked. Where?
Newsletter.bigpodcast.com.
That's right, Dave Jackson. Newsletter.bigpodcast.com. Final thought for you. If you want to subscribe to this podcast and make sure you never miss an episode, and I know you're concerned about that, this is how to do it. Bigpodcast.com/subscribe. The kids, they're calling it follow these days. And if I was teaching teenagers podcasting, I would say, hey, do you want to follow Build a Big Podcast? And they would know what I was talking about. But you're a little older than that. You're still calling it subscribe. And that's why I'm also calling it subscribe. So go to this URL, bigpodcast.com/subscribe. That will give you 3 options, 1 for iPhone, 1 for Android, an old school RSS feed, and a secret 4th option. It's a QR code that you can scan. Either one of these will get you Build a Big Podcast instantly as soon as I deliver it. That's once or twice a week. Keep it as long as you want. Take the good, leave the bad. You can do it all at bigpodcast.com/subscribe. Thank you for listening. I'll see you on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast.